Hello, everybody. This week, we are going to look at the letter to the church in Philadelphia for our 15 minutes in Revelation as we continue to look at the letters to the seven churches. So let's get into the letter to the church to Philadelphia right here, and I'll bring up the slides, and there we go. So again, let's start about first looking at the city of Philadelphia a little bit in context. Ancient Philadelphia, it was an important trade center in Asia Minor, and like all of the Roman cities and Roman culture of the day, it was very immersed in paganism and, of course, the Roman culture, the materialistic Roman culture. Philadelphia was known as the door to Asia. It was, again, a major trading center and kind of marked the point between trade from the West and Asia Minor towards the East and the rest of the continent of Asia. It also had a notable Jewish population, as we'll pick up on as we read this letter, which apparently was very aggressive in its opposition to the church. Again, as we talked about before, in some cities, the Jewish population and the Christian population were sometimes seen as one and identified as one religion by the Roman authorities and residents around them. However, in certain places, and apparently Philadelphia is one of them, the Jews were making very certain to draw a distinction and even persecuting the church there. And Philadelphia, like other cities in Asia Minor, were plagued by and at times even destroyed by earthquakes. Again, back then, they didn't always have the construction that could stand up to massive earthquakes the way we know to engineer certain structures today. And so in Asia Minor, and Philadelphia being one of those cities, earthquakes could sometimes result in massive, if not total, destruction of a city. In fact, on a couple of notable occasions, the city of Philadelphia was rebuilt after the earthquake of 17 CE, or AD if you prefer. The city was rebuilt by the Roman Emperor Tiberius and was renamed Neo Caesarea in his honor. It was rebuilt again by the next Roman dynasty, the Flavian dynasty, or another Roman dynasty after the quake of 60 CE. So this was something that had occurred a couple of times in Philadelphia. We'll see where that context can have some relevance for us as we read through the letter and look at what it means. First of all, Revelation 3, verse 7 through 13. To the angel to the church in Philadelphia, write, "These are the words of him who is holy and true, who holds the key of David. What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open. I know your deeds. See, I have placed before you an open door that no one can shut. I know that you have little strength, yet you have kept my word and have not denied my name. I will make those who are of the synagogue of Satan, who claim to be Jews, though they are not, but are liars, I will make them come and fall down at your feet and acknowledge that I have loved you. Since you have kept my command to endure patiently, I will also keep you from the hour of trial that is going to come on the whole world to test the inhabitants of the earth. I am coming soon. Hold on to what you have so that no one will take your crown. The one who is victorious, I will make a pillar in the temple of my God. Never again will they leave it. I will write on them the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which is coming down out of heaven from my God. And I will also write on them my new name. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches." Okay. So Jesus here, again, we've talked about how there's much meaning in these letters and how Jesus introduces himself in each one. And here he introduces himself as the one who is holy and true. Not exact wording from Revelation chapter 1, although verse 5, he is referred to by John as the faithful witness. But in referring to himself as the one who is holy and true, Jesus is surely emphasizing his lordship as holy and pure, and really placing himself in the place of Yahweh himself. And so this is really attesting to his deity as well. And he's assuring his disciples that his words are truth and can be believed and trusted. And so something we can take away from this is, just like these disciples in Philadelphia were to be encouraged by the trustworthiness of Jesus, so too we should be encouraged by how trustworthy our Lord is. He's going to reassure them. He's going to let them know the reward they can look forward to for their faithfulness. In the same way, we should also be very encouraged by how trustworthy Jesus is and believe in his word and believe in his promises just as strongly as they do. In this letter, a letter in which the church is not at all rebuked. I mean, this is the kind of letter you want to get from the Lord, right? He's only positive in his praise for them and reassuring them of the reward that awaits them if they remain faithful. But in this letter, there's this theme of kind of the true Israel versus a, quote, synagogue of Satan. And we've seen this phrase used in some earlier letters. That synagogue of Satan really is referring to those who are of the Jewish faith, but really aren't God's people. They're not faithful to God. Again, this would be that Jewish population that was very anti-Christian and opposing the Christians in Philadelphia. And the wording, some of the wording that we see here in Revelation, such as Jesus being the one who holds the key of David, he's opening a door no one can shut, these sorts of things. This is language that John seems to be taking from, or Jesus seems to be quoting to John from the prophet Isaiah. And this is a passage that would have certainly come to mind for John's readers and listeners as they heard this. Again, this would have been an audience that would have been familiar with and known their Old Testament text. The prophecies in the scriptures that are often quoted from the Old Testament, they're not quoted because John's necessarily dealing with the fulfillment of that specific prophecy, but he chooses that wording because he wants them to get the same basic message. There's a principle in the prophecy that applies to their current situation, in this case, in Philadelphia, that he wants them to understand. And so he uses that wording and quotes that scripture or refers to it so that they will get that message. And in this case, we see language from Isaiah chapter 22, verses 15 through 17 and verses 20 through 22. And it reads this way. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Go say to this steward, to Shebna, the palace administrator, what are you doing here, and who gave you permission to cut out a grave for yourself here? Hewing your grave on the height and chiseling your resting place in the rock. Beware, the Lord is about to take firm hold of you and hurl you away, you mighty man. Now we read that portion and go, well, I don't see where this has anything to do with Revelation 3. Well, this is kind of laying the foundation of what the rest of the prophecy is going to talk about, a prophecy which might be, which is going to be referring to, things obviously in Israel's history. But here he refers to Shebna, the palace administrator. Shebna was apparently a foreigner, not an Israelite, who had risen to this high position, really second to the king, palace administrator. And apparently he was a man who loved the exalted position, who loved to be thought of as important, who loved to be thought of as next in line to the king. Hence the reference to wanting to cut out a grave for yourself here. He had already, he wanted the place of one day being honored with some, a place of significance when it came to a tomb for himself and that sort of thing. And he's not an Israelite, but a foreigner. And here he's told that the Lord is going to take firm hold of him. I will hurl you away. In other words, I am going to humble you. Well, later in the passage, in verse 20, it says, in that day, I will summon my servant Eliakim, son of Hilkiah. Eliakim is an Israelite. Okay. Eliakim is an Israelite. It says, I will summon Eliakim. I will clothe him with your robe and fasten your sash around him. Again, he's talking to Shebna here, and hand your authority over to him. He will be a father to those who live in Jerusalem and to the people of Judah. He will be in that place of exalted authority and respect and honor. I will place on his shoulder, now this is where it sounds very familiar to Revelation, the key to the house of David. What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open. And so this wording would have been very familiar, would have come to mind when they heard John's words in Revelation 3. The message that I think John is trying to get across right here is, look, again, it goes back to you as the church, you as the disciples are the true Israelites. You are the true holy nation of God, not these Jews, this synagogue of Satan who oppose you. Yes, they're Jewish, but they aren't truly God's people. And one of the things that would have been a key to understanding that is that in Revelation, when you draw the parallel with Isaiah 22, is it is the Jewish opposition that is placed in the role of the Gentile, Shebna, while it is the church, the disciples, who are placed in the role of the Israelite, Eliakim. The Jews in Philadelphia want to think of themselves as the exalted holy ones, the people of God, but in reality, they're not. God's going to humble them. It's actually the church that will be given that role, that place of honor, that's truly God's holy nation now. And we've seen this message before in earlier letters. So again, the message is the followers of Jesus who constitute the true spiritual Israel, to which the Lord will ultimately give the authority and privilege of reigning with him in his kingdom, the kingdom of David, the messianic kingdom, not those who are simply Jewish by birth. The church is commended again in this letter. There's no rebuke or correction. He says that despite little strength, they have kept the Lord's word and have not denied his name. Little strength could mean, one, that they're small in number. A number of commentators that I've read and studied believe that there's a very strong indication this might mean that they just were not very strong in number. But it can also mean just that they are facing a great wave of Roman culture and worldliness that they are trying to resist. But regardless of what the meaning is, the fact that they have kept the Lord's word and have not denied his name, they have remained faithful, and that's what they are being commended for. He talks about the open door no one can close. Well, this can mean several things, and likely does. Matthew 7:7-8, we see the open door referred to as an analogy by Jesus, talking about an open door to prayer. The one who knocks, the door will be open. And he's talking about prayer there and pursuing God in prayer. We also see in Romans 8:31-39 that for the one who is faithful to God, no one can rip them away from the love of God and the relationship with God that they have. That door cannot be closed. So there's certainly an open door to relationship with God and access to God. We also see in 1 Corinthians 16:9, as well as in 2 Corinthians 2:12 and Colossians 4:3, the open door analogy is often used to refer to an open door to the Lord's work, an open door to be able to share the gospel. And so it seems that the Philadelphian disciples have been assured that they have an open door to God, their access to God that no one can close. And God has and will continue to open a door for their mission as well. And so we can believe the same, that God has opened a door for us, that when we walk in faith and live as disciples of Jesus, we have an open door to God no one can close. And God has opened a door for us as well to impact lives, to share the gospel, and to forward his mission. There is an open door of evangelism before us in our daily lives as well. He also says, I will keep you from the hour of trial that is going to come on the whole world to test the inhabitants of the earth. What does this mean? Well, he's apparently referring to some kind of imminent trial, which will come during the lifetime of these disciples. This is not some reference to an end of time tribulation per se. And that it is probably going to be used predominantly to pass judgment on and expose unbelievers and idolaters. In other places in Revelation, whenever it talks about the inhabitants of the earth, it generally is referring to those who are not believers, who are not part of the church. And so it could mean that the disciples will be spared this trial altogether, or it could also simply mean that they will be sustained and empowered to endure the trial because of their faith. And if you think about it, that's often the case for us as disciples, isn't it? We aren't necessarily spared the trials that the rest of the culture faces or endures, but because of our faith, we're better equipped to see God at work in it, God's purpose in it, and endure and withstand the trial better than most, because we know of a sovereign God who's in control, who loves us, and will only allow or cause that which would ultimately be for our spiritual welfare and benefit. There's promised blessing for the victorious in verses 11-13. I won't take time to read it here, but if you go to Isaiah 62 and read 1-3, you'll see some language that brings to mind verses 11-13 of Revelation 3. And it's a prophecy of proclaiming the word of God, proclaiming the victory of God rather than denying it, which is what this church is being commended for. You see reference to those faithful being given a crown. Well, that's what he's telling the disciples in Philadelphia, right? You have been given a crown. Hold on to your crown. In other words, remain faithful, and you too will be given a new name. The building and establishment of God's city is referred to here. And so really the prophecy in Isaiah 62 is a prophecy of victory and vindication. And so that's the message that John would want them to get, is understanding that if you remain faithful and hold on, you too are going to be victorious and receive the vindication that you deserve. He talks about you'll be a pillar in the temple of my God. Well, in 2 Chronicles chapter 3, this may very well have been a passage that would have come to mind for people. It talks about the purity and the holiness of the temple, how it would be, so much of it would be made of pure gold, its purity and its holiness. And there are two pillars that are mentioned, and they're both given a name. So this could have been something that would have come to mind for the readers of Revelation 3 and would have brought to mind in them the importance of, yes, remain pure, continue to be holy, remain part of God's, be that pillar in God's temple. And of course, Ephesians 2:21 through 22, and 1 Corinthians 3:16 through 17 and 6:19 all make reference to us collectively as the church and for us as individual disciples, that we today are God's temple. It was also a common practice in the pagan culture of that day that the names of prominent citizens who the city wanted to honor would often erect a pillar in that person's honor and with their name inscribed upon it. So it could also be a reference to that common practice that John is trying to make the point that, look, Jesus has said, you too will be honored. You will be honorable in my sight, a pillar in the temple of my God, if you remain faithful. So what are some takeaways from this letter to Philadelphia? Well, I think it's important for us to understand as practical application for us. Jesus does not judge a church by its size or its outward strength, but by its faithfulness. It's not about how big we are in numbers, but how faithful are we? Are we truly living crucified lives as disciples of Jesus Christ? Is the faithful disciples the church who comprise the true spiritual Israel? It is the church that is the holy people of God and the recipient of God's promises to Abraham. It wasn't enough back then to simply be a Jew. You had to put your faith in Jesus Christ. By the same token today, we need to remember it is not enough to be a churchgoer. We have to put our true faith in Jesus Christ. We need to hold fast and remain faithful, just as the Philadelphian disciples were called to. Proclaim the gospel, walk through the open door that God's provided for us, both in access to him on a daily basis and also the open door of being able to share the gospel with others and be pillars in the temple of our God. Stand up for and strive to remain to be those righteous pillars, right? Because we are the dwelling in which God now lives here on earth. It tells us that in Ephesians 2 and in 1 Corinthians 3. And also be encouraged, just as the Philadelphian disciples should have been encouraged by the trustworthiness of Jesus, so too we should be encouraged and remain faithful because of the trustworthiness of our God. And so with that in mind, that concludes this week's session of Revelation and looking at the church in Philadelphia.